There is a golden mask. You have seen it 1,000 times, in textbooks, in museums, on television, on the internet. The face of a young man, serene and perfect, staring out at the world from beneath 3,000 years of silence. It is the most recognizable object from the ancient world, more famous than the Parthenon, more iconic than the Colosseum, more instantly recognizable than almost anything human hands have ever made. And yet, almost nobody knows the real story behind it. They know the mask, they know the name, they know the vague outline of a story, a boy king, a cursed tomb, archaeologists dying in mysterious circumstances. But the real story of Tutankhamun is something entirely different. It is a story about a boy who was born into the most dangerous royal family in the history of ancient Egypt. A family torn apart by religious revolution, political conspiracy, and murder. A boy who became king at 9 years old, inherited a kingdom in chaos, and died under circumstances that have never been fully explained. It is a story about what happened after he died, how his name was erased from history, how his tomb was hidden so completely that it remained undiscovered for 3,000 years, and how a single discovery in 1922 changed our understanding of the ancient world forever. And it is a story about what we still don't know, because despite everything, despite the archaeologists and the scientists and the CT scans and the DNA analysis, the most important question about Tutankhamun has never been answered. How did a healthy young king die at 18 years old? This is the real story of Tutankhamun, and it is nothing like history says. To understand Tutankhamun, you first need to understand the world he was born into. Ancient Egypt in the mid-14th century BC was the most powerful civilization on Earth. It had existed for over 1,000 years. Its pharaohs were considered living gods. Its temples were the largest structures ever built by human hands. Its armies had conquered an empire stretching from modern Sudan to the borders of what is now Turkey. It was a civilization of extraordinary stability. The same religious rituals had been performed for centuries. The same gods had been worshipped for generations. The same system of government had functioned without interruption for longer than most civilizations had existed at all. And then, a man named Amenhotep IV became pharaoh, and he destroyed all of it. Amenhotep IV did something that no Egyptian pharaoh had ever done before, and no Egyptian pharaoh would ever do again. He abolished the entire Egyptian religious system. He closed the temples. He dismissed the priests. He declared that there was only one God, the Aten, the disk of the sun, and that he himself was the sole intermediary between that God and humanity. He changed his name to Akhenaten. He built an entirely new capital city in the desert. He ordered the names of the old gods chiseled off monuments across the entire kingdom. He was Tutankhamun's father. The religious revolution that Akhenaten unleashed Egypt tore Egypt apart. The priests who had held power for centuries were stripped of everything. The ordinary people who had prayed to Osiris and Isis and Amun for generations were told their gods did not exist. The military and political establishment watched in horror as their pharaoh dismantled the foundations of the civilization they had spent their lives serving. And then Akhenaten died, and the chaos he left behind fell onto the shoulders of a 9-year-old boy.
His birth name was Tutankhamun, meaning living image of the Aten, the new god his father had imposed on Egypt. He was approximately 9 years old when he became pharaoh. We do not know exactly when he was born. We do not know who his mother was with certainty. DNA analysis suggests she may have been one of Akhenaten's sisters, which would make Tutankhamun the product of a sibling marriage. a practice that was not unusual in Egyptian royal families, but which had devastating consequences for his health. He was a sickly child. We know this from his body. When archaeologists examined his mummy in the early 20th century, they found a young man who had suffered from a remarkable number of physical problems for someone so young. He had a clubfoot, he had a cleft palate, he had scoliosis, he had multiple malaria infections detectable in his DNA. He walked with a cane. Over 100 walking sticks were found in his tomb, and analysis of his skeleton shows genuine bone disease that would have made walking painful. This was not a warrior pharaoh. This was not a conquering hero. This was a fragile young boy, physically compromised from birth, placed on the most powerful throne on earth at an age when most children were still learning to read. And around him, in the court of Egypt, were some of the most dangerous and ambitious men in the ancient world. Two men in particular. An elderly official who had served in the court of Akhenaten and who positioned himself as the young king's advisor and guardian, and Horemheb, the commander of the Egyptian army, a powerful general who had watched Akhenaten's religious revolution with barely concealed fury, and who had spent years waiting for the opportunity to restore Egypt to what it had been before. These two men effectively ran Egypt while Tutankhamun was king. The question that has haunted historians for a century is this: did one of them decide the boy had outlived his usefulness? Despite his youth and his physical limitations, Tutankhamun's reign was not without significance. Almost immediately after taking the throne, the 9-year-old king, guided by his advisors, began to reverse everything his father had done. The temples of the old gods were reopened. The priests were restored to their positions. The military and administrative establishment that Akhenaten had dismantled was rebuilt. He changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, replacing the reference to his father's god with a reference to Amun, the god his father had tried to erase. He moved the capital back to Thebes. He commissioned new statues of the old gods. He restored the religious festivals that had been canceled under his father. He effectively undid, in the space of a few years, the entire religious revolution that Akhenaten had spent his reign building. For the priests of Amun, who had lost everything under Akhenaten, the young king was a savior. For the military establishment, who had watched the army neglected while their pharaoh built temples to a sun disk, the restoration of the old order was long overdue. Tutankhamun was becoming genuinely useful. He was also growing up. By the time he was 17 or 18, he was no longer the 9-year-old boy who had been placed on the throne. Despite his physical problems, he was developing into a young man with his own opinions, his own preferences, his own sense of what kind of pharaoh he wanted to be. He was learning to drive chariots. Images of him hunting from a chariot were found in his tomb, suggesting that despite his clubfoot, he was determined to project the image of a warrior king. He had a wife, Ankhesenamun, who was the daughter of Akhenaten, and who would have understood better than anyone the political dangers surrounding her young husband. And then, at 18 years old, he died. No warning. No prolonged illness recorded in any historical source, no battle, no assassination attempt described by any ancient writer. He was simply there, and then he was gone.
The cause of Tutankhamun's death has been debated by historians, archaeologists, and scientists for over 100 years. The theories are numerous and contradictory. The original examination of his mummy in 1925, conducted hastily and with the technology of the time, suggested he may have died from a blow to the back of the head. For decades, this was the dominant theory. Tutankhamun had been murdered. The most likely suspect was his elderly advisor, who became pharaoh immediately after Tutankhamun's death and who married Tutankhamun's widow, Ankhesenamun, a marriage she almost certainly did not choose freely. Then, in 2005, a CT scan of the mummy was conducted using modern technology. The team of scientists who performed the scan concluded that the bone fragment at the back of the skull had most likely occurred after death, during the mummification process or in the centuries since. They found no evidence of a murder blow. But they found something else: a badly broken leg, a fracture so severe and so close to the time of death that it may have been the direct cause of his death, perhaps through infection or blood loss or both. Then DNA analysis in 2010 added another layer of complexity. The analysis confirmed that Tutankhamun had been infected with multiple strains of malaria. It also revealed the extent of his genetic problems. The product of generations of inbreeding in the royal family, his body was already compromised before any external injury. So, was it murder? Was it an accident? Was it disease? Was it simply the accumulated physical burden of a body that had been damaged from birth? After a century of investigation, using the most advanced technology available, the honest answer is that we still do not know. And that uncertainty is part of what makes Tutankhamun so endlessly fascinating. What happened after Tutankhamun died is, in some ways, even more disturbing than the mystery of how he died. His widow, Ankhesenamun, found herself in an almost impossible position. She was the last surviving child of Akhenaten. She had no children. 2 pregnancies had ended in the deaths of premature babies, whose tiny mummified bodies were found in Tutankhamun's tomb. She was surrounded by powerful men who wanted to control Egypt, and she had no allies. What she did next is one of the most remarkable and desperate acts in all of ancient history. She wrote a letter to the king of the Hittites, Egypt's most powerful enemy, a rival empire to the north. The letter has survived. In it, she says something that must have shocked the Hittite king when he read it. She said that her husband was dead, that she had no son, that she did not want to marry one of her own servants, a reference to I, and that she was asking the Hittite king to send one of his sons to Egypt to become her husband and the next pharaoh. An Egyptian queen asking the king of Egypt's greatest enemy to send a prince to marry her. The desperation behind that letter is almost unbearable to read. The Hittite king was suspicious. He sent messengers to verify the request was genuine. Ankhesenamun sent a second letter, more urgent than the first, confirming everything. The Hittite king sent his son. The prince never arrived in Egypt. He was murdered on the way, almost certainly on the orders of either I or Horemheb. And Ankhesenamun disappeared from history. Her name never appears in any Egyptian record after she married I. What happened to her, whether she died, was killed, or simply vanished into obscurity, nobody knows. The last child of Akhenaten, gone. I became pharaoh after Tutankhamun. He ruled for 4 years and then died, probably of old age. After I, Horemheb, the general who had waited so long for power, finally became pharaoh. And what Horemheb did next tells us everything about how dangerous the memory of Tutankhamun and his family had become. He erased them. Not metaphorically, literally. Horemheb ordered the systematic destruction of every record of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and I. Their names were chiseled off monuments, their statues were demolished, their tombs were stripped of anything that could identify them. The new capital city that Akhenaten had built was torn down stone by stone. Horemheb took credit for the restoration of Egypt's religious system that Tutankhamun had actually begun. He inserted his own name into monuments that Tutankhamun had built.
He effectively rewrote the history of the previous 3 decades, erasing an entire generation of pharaohs from the official record. The lists of Egyptian kings that later pharaohs maintained, the official record of who had ruled Egypt and in what order, jumped directly from Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, to Horemheb. Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, and I simply did not exist in the official history of Egypt. It was one of the most complete acts of historical erasure in the ancient world. And it almost worked. Because of that erasure, when Tutankhamun was buried in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a tomb that was modest by royal standards, hastily prepared, far smaller than a pharaoh of his status would normally have received, nobody remembered him. Nobody looked for him. Nobody maintained his tomb or performed the rituals that would keep his memory alive. The desert sand covered the entrance to his tomb, and for 3,200 years he slept. On November 4th, 1922, a team of workers excavating in the Valley of the Kings discovered a step cut into the bedrock beneath the sand, then another step and another. 16 steps leading down to a plastered doorway bearing official seals, intact, unbroken, a tomb that had not been opened in over 3,000 years. The archaeologist in charge was a British Egyptologist named Howard Carter. He had been searching the Valley of the Kings for years, funded by a wealthy English aristocrat named Lord Carnarvon, looking for the one royal tomb that had never been found. On November 26, 1922, Carter made a small hole in the inner doorway and held a candle up to the darkness beyond. Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him, asked if he could see anything. Carter's response has become one of the most famous sentences in the history of archaeology. "Yes," he said, "wonderful things." What he saw in the candlelight was a room packed from floor to ceiling with objects, gilded furniture, statues, chariots, jewelry, weapons, clothing, food, wine, everything a young king would need for eternity. Objects so beautiful, so perfectly preserved, that Carter stood in silence for several minutes, unable to speak. It took Carter and his team 10 years to fully excavate and document the tomb. They found over 5,000 individual objects: the golden death mask, the solid gold innermost coffin, the alabaster canopic jars containing the young king's organs, the tiny mummified bodies of his 2 premature children placed in his tomb so he would not be alone in death. And in the innermost chamber, inside 3 nested coffins, the mummy of the boy himself.
The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb triggered what newspapers at the time called Tutmania, a global obsession with ancient Egypt that swept through popular culture in the 1920s and has never entirely faded. But it also triggered something darker. Within months of the tomb's opening, Lord Carnarvon, the man who had funded the excavation, died in Cairo. He had been bitten by a mosquito, the bite had become infected, and he had developed blood poisoning. He was 57 years old. The newspapers seized on the story immediately. Howard Carter had found an inscription in the tomb, they reported, that read, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." There was no such inscription. Carter himself denied it repeatedly and with considerable irritation. The story was completely fabricated by journalists who recognized that a curse was a better story than a mosquito bite. But the legend of the curse of Tutankhamun had been born. Over the following years, as other people connected to the excavation died, the newspapers kept count. Each death was added to the tally of the curse's victims. The reality was considerably less dramatic. Howard Carter himself, the man who had actually opened the tomb and touched the mummy, lived until 1939, 17 years after the discovery, dying of lymphoma at the age of 64.
Most of the people involved in the excavation lived perfectly normal lifespans. There was no curse. But there was something real hidden in the legend, something that scientists would only discover decades later. Studies of ancient Egyptian tombs have found evidence of potentially dangerous molds and bacteria preserved in the sealed environments. Whether these could cause illness in modern humans who entered the tombs is still debated, but the science suggests that the curse, while fictional, was not entirely without a basis in reality. The tomb was dangerous, just not in the way the newspapers said. Here is what we know about Tutankhamun with certainty. He was born into a family destroyed by religious revolution. He was physically damaged from birth by generations of inbreeding. He became king at 9 years old in a kingdom in chaos. He spent his short reign trying to undo the damage his father had caused. He died at 18 under circumstances that have never been fully explained. His memory was systematically erased by the men who came after him. And because his memory was erased, because nobody remembered him, because his modest tomb was overlooked and forgotten and buried under the desert for 3,000 years, his tomb was the only royal Egyptian burial ever found substantially intact. The very act of forgetting him preserved him. If Tutankhamun had been remembered, if his tomb had been maintained and visited and venerated like the tombs of greater pharaohs, it would have been robbed in antiquity like virtually every other royal Egyptian tomb. The 5,000 objects that Howard Carter found would have been scattered across the ancient world. The golden mask would have been melted down for its metal. The mummy would have been unwrapped by treasure hunters searching for amulets. Instead, because he was forgotten, everything survived. The boy that history tried to erase became the most famous person in the history of ancient Egypt. The pharaoh who was supposed to disappear forever stares out at us today from the cover of every history book, from the walls of every museum that has hosted his treasures, from the screens of everyone who has ever searched his name. 3,000 years of silence, and then the whole world knew his name. If this story changed how you see one of history's most famous faces, leave a like. It helps more than you know. Subscribe for weekly videos on the greatest untold stories from the ancient world. See you in the next one.